Pocahontas has been a legend for so long, it's almost hard to believe she was an actual person.
Pocahontas was a real girl who walked around the same way we walk around today.
She grew up to become the most famous American Indian woman in history.
And that puts her in the class of, Cleopatra and Joan of Arc.
But how much of the story we know is true?
Did they really understand what they were seeing?
Was Pocahontas a traitor to her own people?
Maybe she was a double agent.
And what keeps her memory alive over 4 centuries?
Pocahontas asked him to give her this man's life.
Once a whole generation is told a story that they love, it tends to last, and this one lasted.
We could tell you exactly where in the church she stood. That gives me the goosebumps.
Hers is a story we tell ourselves about America. A founding mother who still defines us today. For 400 years, Pocahontas has been a household name. We may think of her story as ancient history, but her people are still very much alive.
This is a historic year for us. The Pamunkey tribe is received from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They have been just recognized as a federal tribe. So congratulations.
The Indians that we project romantically into our kind of past, for many Americans to learn that, well, wait a minute, the descendants of those same so-called mythical Indians that are supposed to have faded away are still with us today.
The most famous and mythic American Indian story of all is Pocahontas.
She was seen as a really consequential person in American history from the very beginning.
She's been celebrated as an American princess.
She was seen as royalty. She was famous on 2 continents while still a teenager.
She's even a Disney princess. The story that's been passed down through the centuries is a romance. A love that unites 2 cultures and creates lasting peace. Forging 2 worlds into one. But even written history can have a curious habit of getting it all wrong.
The kind of Romeo and Juliet story, the John Smith and Pocahontas story, very likely never happened.
The true story is less of a fairy tale. Kidnapping, conflict, starvation, cannibalism, an ocean journey, and the future of an entire civilization make up the real story of Pocahontas. The story starts years before the Pilgrims arrive at Plymouth Rock, when 3 British ships make landfall in what is today the state of Virginia. They are there to found the first English colony in the New World.
I'd say it's pretty widespread belief that the Puritans, more accurately, the Pilgrims who arrived at Plymouth in 1620 was the first permanent English colony. But it was actually preceded by Jamestown 13 years earlier in 1607.
104 settlers, financed by London investors and with the permission of King James I, have come to search for gold and a water passage to the Pacific Ocean. They are explorers, mercenaries, and tradespeople looking to make their fortunes. Of course, it's only the New World to them. The Indian Algonquin people have lived here for thousands of years.
When the English arrived, they were stepping into a really intricate landscape that involved an extremely large and powerful chiefdom.
The chief Wahusanaca, or Chief Powhatan, was Pocahontas's father. As his daughter, she has gone down in history as a princess.
We know that the princess isn't very accurate because she had tons of sisters and brothers, and none of them were called princes or princesses. But she was a daughter of a powerful leader. I think America wants royalty, right? There's an envy of royalty. So it's kind of cool that, you know, our royal will be like an Indian.
Popular culture imagines her as a grown woman. But in 1607, Pocahontas was a girl of 9 or 10.
Pocahontas was a real girl who walked around the same way we walk around. What made her laugh may have been different from what makes us laugh, but that spark of joy when she was giggling was the same as the spark of joy in any young girl today.
Her real name was Motoaka. Pocahontas was just a nickname. Depending on who you ask, it either meant spoiled child or playful one. Either way, it suggests a carefree childhood for the chief's daughter. But the arrival of the colonists would put that reality to the test.
I think the English get mixed messages. There are some Indian peoples along the James River who welcome them, trade, and there are Indian peoples that are more hostile.
Just a month after making landfall, the settlers are attacked by 200 Indians. 2 colonists are killed and 11 are wounded. The attack was just the first sign that life in Jamestown might not live up to expectations. It was swampy, mosquito-infested, and the water was impure. Before long, the colonists were battling disease and hunger.
Finding food and finding provisions to keep that colony alive was one of the toughest jobs, not just for Jamestown, actually. Most European colonies failed within 12 months.
They soon realized they are woefully unprepared.
The English have been laughed at, in a sense, by historians for arriving without any clear sense of how they're going to support themselves.
Despite abundant fishing and hunting, the English simply lack the requisite know-how to make their food supply meet demand.
They're surrounded by food. Like, I go to Jamestown Island, I'm like, you could have eaten that. You could have eaten that. I mean, maybe it wasn't there, 400 years ago, but I'm pretty sure it was.
As winter sets in, the problem intensifies. To the Powhatan, they hardly seem like a threat.
For a long time, Indians in Virginia actually thought the English came to look for food because their experience of seeing the English was they were desperately hungry all the time. They were clueless about fishing. They were clueless about farming. So maybe they came here because where they're from, it's even worse.
Jamestown was led by a short, brash soldier for hire named John Smith. Smith actually arrived in the New World a prisoner after a conflict at sea landed him in the brig. But the colony quickly realizes they need him to survive. It is his search for food that brings the English into contact with Pocahontas.
It was John Smith, in fact, who met her. He had gone up the Chickahominy River hoping to be able to trade for some corn because the colonists were so hungry.
With Jamestown on the verge of starvation, a desperate Smith travels through unexplored territory and is set upon by a group of Powhatan warriors.
John Smith was someone who never lacked for self-confidence. He believed he knew best. Almost in any situation, he's trying to hold them off with his pistol.
Despite the weapon, he's far outnumbered. They capture Smith, and over the next several weeks march him from village to village, displaying him like a curiosity.
He was paraded around at various villages before being taken to Werowocomoco, which means king's house or chief's house. It's where Powhatan, Pocahontas' father, lived, and where she lived, too.
At Powhatan's Werawakomako Longhouse, he is brought before the Great Chief. It's a historic meeting of cultures.
He is the first settler to really involve himself with the chiefs. No one had done it before him, no.
As a European, he likely would have underestimated Powhatan.
We have every reason to believe that a man like Powhatan was extremely intelligent, extremely sharp, would have had a higher IQ than your average person anywhere, including your average person in England.
What Smith says happened next is the genesis of the Pocahontas legend.
2 great stones were brought before Powhatan. Then as many as could laid hands on him dragged him to them, and thereon laid his head, and being ready with their clubs to beat out his brains.
It was to be an execution. But just when death seemed like a certainty, he was saved.
Pocahontas, the king's dearest daughter, when no entreaty could prevail, got his head in her arms and laid her own upon his to save him from death.
She saves Smith, and with him the colony itself. The legend lasts through the ages. But is it even true? For throwing herself between the leader of the Jamestown colony and a warrior's club, Pocahontas becomes a bridge between cultures and a savior of the future nation. Or at least that's how the story plays in the movies. And that's how it's enshrined in the very heart of democracy, the U.S. Capitol building.
The rotunda of the U.S. Capitol was built to evoke the Roman Pantheon. And it's a very majestic place. And in the top of the dome is the painting, the apotheosis of George Washington. And then 3 images of Pocahontas are under that painting of George Washington. So she's in a very, very significant place.
Most famously, she appears in the frieze that encircles the dome.
The colony is the first place in the New World that representative form of government takes root. And so that morphs into Pocahontas saving the birthplace of democracy.
According to legend, without Pocahontas, the capital itself might not exist. The story is part of the country's DNA. But did it really happen?
John Smith sent a report home to England as soon as he was released, a couple months later, and he never said anything about that at all. In fact, he said that they treated him with what kindness they could, that was a quote, and clearly wanted to negotiate with him and form some sort of trade relationship.
It's possible that Smith misinterpreted an adoption ceremony as an execution.
Another theory is that he was being tested by Indian priests as to whether he was worthy of being saved. And this culminates when he reaches Werakomako because Powhatan offers to adopt him as a Powhatan, the elite group of this chiefdom.
His capture and then his release was an attempt to make him a kind of captain or a member of the Confederacy and to try to bring Jamestown under the rule of Powhatan.
After John Smith is saved, Powhatan refers to him as son. And some have argued that that was his way of initiating Smith into this kind of Powhatan system of hierarchy where John Smith is now his son, Powhatan is his father, you are subservient to your father, right?
Adopting Smith would make perfect sense for a shrewd leader like Powhatan.
John Smith is going to be a valuable ally of the Powhatans within James Fort. They want to turn, if you like, one of the leaders to their cause.
Ceremony or execution, historians don't believe Pocahontas would have been present.
experts insist that she was far too young as a young woman to participate in ceremonies like that. So very likely, from their perspective, she didn't participate.
If it happened at all, Smith kept the life-saving story under wraps for decades. Although he published about his Virginia adventures in 1608 and 1612, it doesn't appear in print until his 1624 book, General History of Virginia.
Only years later, when all the principals were dead, did he come up with that story. Nobody was left to contradict it.
He also spins the romantic tale.
Wouldn't it be cool if the daughter of the Indian guy fell in love with the leader of the English colony, and they had this hot romance and lived happily ever after?
From a literary point of view, it makes a much better story. Of course, she was around 11 years old. He was 27.
They certainly knew of each other, but the romance between them very likely was total fiction on part of John Smith's part.
In fact, Smith has a history of fictionalizing his adventures.
Today, Captain Smith is considered a fabulist, that he exaggerated a lot of his tales.
He told the identical story more than once before.
Tales about princesses, young women in other parts of the world also coming in and saving his life just when he was about to be dispatched.
But truth or invention, the story of Pocahontas saving his life takes on a life of its own. A century and a half later, when America achieves independence from Britain, it's back in the spotlight.
The United States wanted to define themselves in contrast to their European origins. How are we American and how are we different from our European foundations? American Indians provided, a kind of a route, a pathway.
From then on, it is taught to generation after generation of American schoolchildren.
Noah Webster wrote not only a dictionary, but also a textbook, and that textbook was used in most of the public schools, and so they all got to know the story of this Pocahontas, who had loved white men so much, especially John Smith, and had thrown herself over his body to save him. And once a whole generation is told the story that they love, it tends to last, and this one lasted all through the years.
So is the story of Pocahontas all a myth? Not exactly. She probably didn't save Smith's life, but she did help save the colony itself. She frequently delivers much-needed food to the fort, and she quickly becomes bilingual.
There is real evidence that she was functioning as a translator, as a useful and successful translator within months.
Language is critical. Early on there was a good deal of misunderstanding. Sign language has got limits, obviously.
John Smith recorded a sort of set of language lessons that he had with her, simple phrases and then simple sentences in the Algonquian language that the Powhatans spoke. And in these sentences, he mentions Pocahontas. So he will say, Pocahontas says, bring me 2 baskets. And then he will write those same words in the Algonquian language that she was teaching him.
Yohokan. Yohokan. Yohokan.
The written record of their language lessons are the only sentences of the now extinct Algonquian language that survive. It was also a matter of survival for John Smith.
Smith is leveraging this position whereby he's the only one who can talk to the great chief, and therefore leverage his position amongst the English. So the rise and fall of John Smith is intimately connected with language and his ability to speak Algonquian and his relationship with Powhatan and with Pocahontas.
For her part, Pocahontas becomes a crucial figure in Jamestown, a child ambassador from the tribe whose goodwill is keeping the colonists alive.
All the English at the fort, at the Jamestown fort, knew her, knew about her. She was a famous Indian to them. Not quite so famous as her father, Father Powhatan, but well known to them nonetheless.
For one thing, numerous accounts from Jamestown colonists tell us she was famous for her cartwheels. But the days of playing in the sunshine won't last. From the original 104 settlers, only 38 remain by the end of 1607. A resupply ship brings new blood and food, but much is lost in a fire in early 1608. A year after arriving in Jamestown, the English still don't seem like a threat to the Powhatan, but they are one. John Smith and Pocahontas have become pop culture icons.
Now here's what I'd like to know. Who played polka with Pocahontas when John Smith went away?
But what really separates them is not very funny. In 1608, Smith becomes president of the colony. He runs a tight ship.
He that will not work shall not eat.
He has negotiated a tenuous peace and the all-important supply of food with the Powhatan. But he can't give the Indians the one thing they really want.
What they want from the English is English weaponry. Copper as well, but primarily weaponry. And not just steel-edged weapons, not just swords and poleaxes and so on. They want firearms. They want cannon, and they want muskets and pistols.
Naturally, the Virginia Company's charter forbids this.
Because he can't deliver. Those personal relationships that Smith had built his fortunes around broke down. That was the end of his preeminence, really, in the colony.
Never well liked, his hardline leadership results in more than one attempt on his life. He survives, but is injured.
He was losing popularity among the men. It was a time to go home for political reasons.
Nursing his wounds, he sets sail to England. Pocahontas is told he has died, and her visits to Jamestown come to an end. Following Smith's departure, conditions in James Fort again grow desperate.
The white people had worn out their welcome. The Indians were no longer bringing corn and other foodstuffs, either as gifts or even to sell. And in fact, the Indians sometimes were attacking them when they left the fort, so the English couldn't even plant crops and try to live on that.
In 1609, their salvation set sail from England, a great fleet carrying 500 more settlers and supplies for all. But nothing goes according to plan.
This fleet was caught in a hurricane in the Atlantic. Many of the ships were damaged and stores were damaged. So 500 people arrive at Jamestown without sufficient provisions. At the same time, there'd been plague in one of those ships that arrived. So you have lack of provisions, disease that swept through the Jamestown, and then Indian peoples choose that moment to attack the English to get rid of them. So you have a trifecta, really, of disasters.
As cold turns to freezing, hunger turns to starvation. They eat rats. They boil and eat their belts and shoes. And when those are gone, they are forced into a darker corner. The 2012 discovery of a colonist's skull, a teenage girl, led Jamestown archaeologists to a grisly reality. she had been eaten.
I've seen cannibalism in many different situations, actually, in North America, prehistoric North America, for instance, and there's just no doubt that that occurred.
This wasn't murder. The girl, reconstructed here, was already dead when some unknown starving settlers consumed her.
There are chops here to the forehead that are very tentative in the sense that they do cut into the bone, but they don't go very deep. It's not something that the person was alive because you would never get such closely spaced chops.
It's the first known evidence of survival cannibalism in North America.
It completely speaks to just how horrible the time was and the fact that they just had nothing to eat.
By the end of winter, more than 150 English, nearly 75% of the colony, are gone. 60-some desperate colonists abandon the fort, only to be turned around by another ship from England and a new governor, Lord Delaware. His supplies resurrect the colony, but open warfare with the Indians now threatens its survival. In 1613, Pocahontas, now a grown woman of 16, once again becomes the colony's unlikely savior. She's visiting the nearby Potawatomi tribe when her Indian hosts, threatened with war by an English ship captain, lure her onto his vessel and betray her.
The kidnapping of Pocahontas is plotted and achieved as a part of creating this kind of leverage over the Powhatan Confederacy in order to maintain a certain amount of stability and peace, and also to maintain the trade, which for Jamestown means food.
Pocahontas is the currency that pays for the colony's survival. She is held prisoner aboard ship for days, then marched from the port through the gates of James Fort. The place she played as a child is now a village of unfamiliar faces. The English demand a ransom of hostages and stolen weapons, which goes only partially paid. Negotiations will drag on for more than a year. Inside the fort walls, in this English world, Pocahontas, the Powhatan woman, is remade. At least on the surface.
We don't know what was going on in her head. She was involved in all these incredible events during a very momentous time in history, but we do not know what she was thinking.
We do know what she meant to the colony.
Pocahontas, her status as the daughter of the great chief is hugely important to the English.
She's important as a piece of collateral, but she is also seen as a soul ripe for conversion.
The Church of England was only 50 years old at the time of the founding of Virginia. It was well known that the Spanish had converted millions of Indian peoples to Catholicism in South America, Middle America. North America was to be English and it was to be Anglican. It was to be Protestant. Building the Church of England by bringing in the entire Powhatan nation was the first step to converting all Indian peoples in North America to the Anglican Church.
Baptizing Pocahontas was the first step in converting the Powhatan nation.
That's why it was important that she was directly related to the great chief.
Over the months in captivity, she is instructed in the Anglican faith, and she becomes the first indigenous person to convert to Christianity in the English New World. She is baptized Rebecca, a soul saved that helped the English justify the moral correctness of colonization.
Europeans And Christians love the idea of coming over here to save the poor heathen Indians from themselves, spread Christianity, and steal our land at the same time.
Was Pocahontas helping them do it? Was she truly devout? Or was she brainwashed by her kidnappers?
Was she exhibiting something like the Stockholm Syndrome? That is, that she was, had become so disempowered, so victimized, that in her psychological devastation, she was identifying with the people who had power over her.
The same questions are asked again more than 3 centuries later with the kidnapping of another important daughter. When heiress Patricia Hearst is captured by a radical leftist group in 1974, she appears to join their cause, even helping them rob a bank, and raises comparisons to Pocahontas.
There become these analyses in the press that talk about, well, gee, Pocahontas was a daughter of a really rich and powerful leader. She was kidnapped. And then we didn't quite know what side she was for. Was she still with her people? Was she for the English?
We still don't know, but the woman who is both Rebecca and Motoaka, nicknamed Pocahontas, is about to meet another Englishman named John. Unlike John Smith, this would be a real love story. Or would it? On the silver screen, the romance of Pocahontas and John Smith plays like a fairy tale. In real life, there may also have been romance, but with an entirely different suitor. While a hostage in Jamestown, she meets a wealthy planter named John Rolfe. In 1614, Rolfe writes to Sir Thomas Dale, governor of the colony, declaring and defending his love for Pocahontas.
To whom my heart and best thoughts are, and have long time been so entangled and enthralled in so intricate a labyrinth.
Rolfe is clearly smitten. Pocahontas may have been motivated by more diplomatic thinking. Her father ruled over a confederacy formed by matrimonial alliances, and he readily agreed to the match.
This alliance through marriage was, I think, twofold: to end the warfare, but to also help Powhatan have more of an influence over the colony.
Was it a marriage of convenience that it guaranteed her safety? Did she love John Rolfe? Who knows, really?
The governor grants his permission and they marry on April 5th, 1614. In 2010, archaeologists discovered the site of the wedding.
In our excavations in the fort, we found various building sites, one of which was the first church. And it was there that Pocahontas was married in 1614. And according to the ceremony, we could tell you exactly where in the church she stood. And I think that gives me the goosebumps.
Today, visitors can stand on the actual spot where the ceremony took place. Once Virginia is firmly established, this kind of interracial union will first become unthinkable, and then, after the abolition of slavery, illegal. 3.5 centuries later, less than 100 miles from Jamestown, another couple will invoke Pocahontas and challenge that law. Mildred Jeter, of African American and Native American descent, marries Richard Loving, who is white. Like Rebecca and John Rolfe, their wedding will make history.
These are two of the most famous interracial marriages, in North America, and with such consequences.
The Lovings were jailed for marrying and forced to leave their home state. At trial, the judge declared,
Almighty God created the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for them to mix.
The couple took their case to the Supreme Court, and in 1967, the decision in Loving versus Virginia invalidated the prohibition of interracial marriage nationwide.
It's really powerful that how central that was and how appropriate it was that decision happened in Virginia. I think that's really kind of perfect.
Pocahontas's marriage also had political ramifications. As Governor Thomas Dale wrote in 1614, it ushered in a period known as the Pocahontas Peace.
Powhatan's daughter is since married to an English gentleman of good understanding, another knot to bind this peace the stronger.
The royal hostage had become a bride, and a diplomat putting the colony on steady ground.
When John Rolfe and Pocahontas married, the English agreed to stop demanding tribute and payments in corn from Powhatan, and to stop demanding that they return all the weapons they had stolen. And the Indians agreed that, for a while at any rate, they would stop attacking the English whenever they left the fort.
During this honeymoon period, Rebecca and John Rolfe have a baby boy. They name him Thomas.
John Rolfe wrote in ecstatic terms both about the peace and about the life he was living on the farm with Pocahontas.
On that farm, Rolfe experiments with a crop that will reverse the fortunes of the colony and determine the future of the country. Tobacco.
North American tobacco, Nicotiana rustica, was much harsher and not as pleasant to smoke socially as southern tobaccos, Nicotiana tabacum, for example, which was the tobacco that the Spanish were exporting. The Spanish guarded their access to that species of tobacco very carefully. It was a capital offense to sell tobacco seeds from the South.
We don't know how Rolfe acquired the precious seeds, but he introduces the southern tobacco to Jamestown. And according to oral tradition, he learns Powhatan methods for curing tobacco from Pocahontas, hanging it to dry rather than laying it on the ground.
It grew so well and sold for so much money back in London that pretty soon almost all the Virginia colonists were planting tobacco, even when they should have been planting food.
Despite high hopes for gold or a route west, Jamestown has never delivered on the investment of its backers until now. But Rolfe's tobacco is a devil's bargain.
You know, this incredibly addictive drug that's killed millions of people around the world, depletes soil, everything else.
It will create a demand for labor that will kick off the slave trade and force Indians off their land. But in the 16 teens, the golden leaf was simply a moneymaker. The first of its kind in Virginia. Its success will also propel Pocahontas's fame.
Her association with tobacco, which never goes away, it starts being used to sell tobacco.
In her lifetime, she's going to be used to sell something else. America itself. In 1616, Pocahontas boards an English ship for the second time. It is captained by the very same man who kidnapped her just 3 years before. But on this voyage, she is an honored guest of the Virginia Company, setting sail for London.
She was pressured to go with her husband and her then very young toddler child to England by the Virginia Company because they desperately needed to use her marriage to John Rolfe as proof that the settlement was viable, that the Indians weren't going to attack, and that it was safe to settle there.
She is very possibly the perfect person for the job.
So all throughout the 1500s, Europeans were thinking of indigenous peoples as cannibals, as idolaters, as brutish, and most of all, as being irredeemably non-Christian. Okay, enter Pocahontas. She is none of these things.
In London, all things Virginia are the rage. The 1609 Bermuda shipwreck of the Sea Venture, the ship John Rolfe sailed on to the New World, inspired Shakespeare's The Tempest and romanticized the promise of Virginia. Pocahontas arrives to find herself very much in fashion.
She took Europe by storm. She shows up speaking English in Elizabethan garb. She shows up as a Christian wife. She shows up as somebody who was invited to the court of King James. So Pocahontas right away becomes somebody that Europeans can relate to and they can understand.
To advertise her visit, the Virginia Company commissions her portrait.
Simon van der Pas, an artist at the time, was asked by the Virginia Company to sketch her and then make an engraving for a brochure.
It's the only picture of her made from life.
It is noteworthy that he did not, at that time, attempt to make her look like your average white English girl, or German girl, or French girl, right? She is very clearly in that image a Native American person.
What did she think of it all? The image contains clues.
They wanted to prove to the London public that the Indians love us. The Indians want us to go to Virginia, so they needed an image of a happy Indian dressed in Elizabethan clothes. But sometimes I wonder if it was partly her decision to put on that fierce expression, staring straight out.
And then there is the Algonquian word for Virginia, phonetically spelled out in English.
Around the band of the picture, there's text. Then underneath, it says, Virginia that is called Tsenakomoko. So where could Simon van der Pas, the artist, have gotten his information? Clearly from her.
She may well have been carefully controlling her image, even as she promoted colonization.
Was Pocahontas a victim, a pawn? There's even been talk, some people even equate her with being a traitor to her own people.
Was she selling the Powhatan out? Or just playing both sides?
Maybe she was a double agent. She's there to gather intelligence, to see this thing that had to be seen to be believed.
We know she made the trip with her father's blessing.
In fact, he sent high-ranking people with her in order that they should learn more about the English and bring back that information.
I have no doubt that Powhatan was also being strategic about her going to this place to learn more about who these, interlopers were, these invaders were.
A meeting with an old friend, returned from the dead, reveals something of her allegiances.
Pocahontas.
John Smith loved fame, and he chased it in any way that he could. And he certainly worked hard when Pocahontas came to London to advertise his own prior connection with her.
If Smith anticipated a heartfelt reunion, he was disappointed. To Pocahontas, he was the sellout.
She felt lied to in terms of having promised not to take their land, to treat them respectfully, etc. And she said that very vociferously in front of a number of people.
Rejecting Smith as a traitor to her people suggests that she was still loyal to the Powhatan, despite her position among the English. What would happen to the Powhatan seems obvious today, but that was not so in the moment.
We're blinded because we know the ending. So everything about Pocahontas is knowing that the English settlement was disastrous for Indian people, and we're collapsing a century of history into, these moments.
After all, in 1616, Jamestown was a struggling colony, always on the verge of starvation.
You would have been the town fool to come in and say, oh, this is what's going to happen, and it's going to be terrible, and we should kill them all now while they're sleeping.
The work of promoting the colony done, in March of 1617, the Rolfe family casts off from London and sails down the Thames en route to Virginia. But they never even reach the ocean. Several passengers, including Pocahontas, are too ill to go on.
We don't know what she was afflicted with. Some even are afraid that she might have been poisoned. She didn't want her to go back. We don't know.
At just 22 years old and an ocean away from her home, Pocahontas dies. John Rolfe leaves their son to be raised by his brother in England. The two will never meet again. But Pocahontas's impact does not end with her death. Her son, Thomas Rolfe, grows up in Britain, but returns to America as an adult in 1635.
He has the estates that John Rolfe created, and he is very wealthy as a result, as a tobacco plantation owner and manager.
His becomes one of the most important first families of Virginia. His mother's bloodline quite literally founds America.
Not only Thomas Jefferson's sister married a descendant of Pocahontas, but his daughter married a descendant of Pocahontas from a different branch of the family as well.
Today, there are more than 30,000 documented descendants of Pocahontas through Thomas Rolfe.
It seems to be appealing to many Americans to say that they are descended from an Indian princess.
Descendants of Pocahontas include Robert E. Lee and First Lady Edith Bowling Galt Wilson. It's lineage that confers status, like being related to passengers on the Mayflower. But is it truly meaningful?
Many of the people who claim to be descendants of her can't even say, when they're asked what tribe or tribes she was affiliated with, know almost nothing about her life.
It's a complicated legacy that would take a surprising turn.
In the 1920s, this is when these ideological chickens come home to roost.
In 1924, Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics, an avowed white supremacist, Walter Plecker, leads an effort to purify the white race. He classifies anyone with one drop of non-white blood as colored, which includes Pocahontas' descendants.
Uh-oh. I brag about my Pocahontas ancestry. So how does that get fixed?
It's fixed by what comes to be known as the Pocahontas exception.
It basically protects these white individuals who claim descendancy from Pocahontas from being moved into the colored category.
At the same time, the colored category lumps everyone together, and on paper, Native Americans lose their unique heritage. Less than 100 years later, the Pamunkey, the surviving members of Pocahontas' tribe, take on the federal government to get that recognition back. At last, the Pocahontas exception does some good.
Plecker, all his efforts to fight against us basically helped our recognition, because if he was fighting so hard against us, then we must have existed. If we didn't exist, why was he fighting? We maintained our identity. It was tough, but we came out of it just knowing who we were.
Pocahontas' fame is eternal. We have been telling ourselves her story for 400 years.
Pocahontas asked him to give her this man's life.
It's really important for the country to see Indians in some way partners to the United States. Pocahontas was there. She was part of things, and we love Pocahontas. People are saying it still matters, and Indians are fundamentally part of the country.
John Smith and Disney may have made her famous. But beyond the myth, hers is a story at the core of the founding of America.